please join me in welcoming Louis Lapham and David Levering Lewis.
Well, I hope is going to be fun. This is a marvelous book, and David Lewis is a marvelous writer. The book that he's going to talk about is called The Improbable Wendell Willkie, the businessman who saved the Republican Party and his country and conceived a new world order. David is a prize-winning historian, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, and I can remember 10 years ago, David, we on this same podcast, we discussed his last book, which was called God's Crucible, Islam and Making of Europe, 570-1215. But this book, he gives us the presence of Wendell Willkie and Willkie's meteoric passage across the American political sky in the years 1939, 1944. He ran as the Republican candidate against Roosevelt in 1940. And this is the same year, 1940, that the British evacuate Dunkirk and the Blitz is heavily in force over London. And Roosevelt later said that had it not been for Willkie, the Republican Party would have prevented America from coming to the aid of Britain, with the probable result that Western civilization would have been lost to Nazi Germany. But Willkie managed to outwit the isolationist leadership of the Republican Party, including, at that time, Herbert Hoover, Robert Taft, Arthur Vandenberg, and the very strong America First contingent, which included Lindbergh, Robert Hutchins, Colonel McCormick, even E.E. Cummings. There was a strong America First sentiment in the country in the late 30s, determined to keep America out of the war. But before we get to those transformative years, 1939, 1944, which I hope we will spend most of this conversation in that time zone. But before we get there, David, tell us, whence cometh Wendell Willkie? Where is he born? What is his youth? What is his early career? What kind of a person is he? What does he look like? Bring him into view.
All of the above. Wendell has an interesting political genealogy. They were 48ers, that is to say, his family prided itself on its standing athwart the advance of Bismarckian authoritarianism in their Germany, in Saxony. And in 1848, the family story was that an ancestor stood with the barricades against the crown prince who massacred protesting students. I think that's not quite the case, but in any case, the Willkies did leave Germany in 1858, and they brought with them that horror of imperialism and of autocracy and of militarism. And so the young Willkie, born in the month of February 1892, his earliest sounds and memories were of his father talking about liberty and democracy. And as he grew in his early years, he had the memory of his father rewriting Kipling's famous line about picking up the white man's burden. And they would say, put it down and put down empire. Soon they were committed William Jennings Bryan advocates. And one vivid memory is of Bryan on his second attempt to capture the presidency, spending the night in Elwood, Indiana, the little town where the Willkies settled, and a debate about the annexation of the Philippines and the acquisition of Puerto Rico, and his father saying these were not the things to do, and Bryan rather torn between his conception of good empire and bad empire. To run the reel faster, Wendell, after some service in World War I, arriving just as the guns fell silent on the Western Front, returned to Elwood, where he would practice law with his mother and father. Interestingly, the mother was one of the first women in Indiana to pass the bar and to practice.
But he had also, before that time, graduated from Indiana Law School, where he's first in his class.
Well,
he's a brilliant student.
He had to do that. That's quite true. Both as an undergraduate, he was stellar. In fact, he alimented the curriculum rather interestingly. He wanted to know more about Marxism and socialism, and so he campaigned for such a course offering. And he was told, if you can have 10 subscribers, and we'll lay on such a course. He got the subscribers. He did. He said later that if a man is not a socialist when he's a young person, then he has no heart. And if he's still a socialist in his maturity, then of course he has no head. So Wendell was flexible and open, as it were, to challenges, intellectual and otherwise. Yes, the law degree came. It was stellar. Unfortunately for him, he almost would not have received it because he was probably following very closely Woodrow Wilson's campaign for his reelection. And he thought that the new freedom entailed all the good things about America that he should help channel in Indiana. And his speech was so radical that the trustees and the visiting members of the Indiana Supreme Court said, this man can't represent us. There was a great controversy there. He was awarded his degree and went off to World War I. Returning, his mother said, you don't want to practice so here in Elwood. You need a larger canvas on which to paint your life. And he ended up working for Harvey Firestone in Akron, Ohio. And there, though this was in those days perhaps the epicenter of isolationism, of regret for our involvement in the First World War and the League of Nations, there was, of course, a governor who was a devotee of Woodrow Wilson, who lay, of course, paralyzed in the White House from his efforts to save his dream of the League. And Governor Cox, and a man who would figure largely in Wendell's life, the young Franklin Roosevelt, ran in 1920 on the Democrat ticket to save the League, as well as to save the accomplishments of the new freedom. Of course, they failed. We had normalcy with Harding. But that was the first convention that Wendell attended, working for Harvey Firestone. That relationship soon soured, and he went to another law firm and attracted a great deal of attention as a stellar advocate. So much so that as he joined boards, one board, Ohio Power and Light, attracted the attention of a figure who should loom large in America for his accomplishments, but I'm afraid has only a decommissioned power plant in Illinois, bearing his name. He was the founder of something that became Commonwealth and Southern, perhaps the third largest electric utility.
You're referring to Samuel Unsel.
No.
No.
No,
Okay.
no.
No?
There is, in fact, a confusion there. Insuls was also Commonwealth and Edison. This was Commonwealth and Southern, but the point is that there's the good utilities magnate, and there's the one to be reproached, and Insull certainly so. But just to put Wendell there as attracting the attention of the founder of Commonwealth and Southern, he was reeled into New York to 1010 Fifth Avenue at a salary that was really quite large, hefty, as its leading attorney. The Depression.
But he's a Hoosier, Indiana, Will Rogers-like figure, right? I mean, and he's got an apartment on Fifth Avenue and an office on Wall Street.
There we go. Pine Street to be
Pine
exact.
Street, okay.
Yes, the texture of this Hoosier is, I think, given in the fact that when they moved into 1010 Fifth Avenue, Willkie never locked the door. Because they didn't do that in Elwood, and as he walked to Wall Street, he was rather puzzled that he didn't see anybody he knew, and so he would stop people and sort of greet them and that sort of thing. So this aw shucks, Will Roger-ish demeanor indeed was, it would have seemed out of place. In fact, it was a benefit to him. So there he is, running this large utility corporation or holding company as the Depression sweeps across America. The man who founded Commonwealth and Southern retreated into the shadows, concerned about investigations for abuses of holding company activities and that sort of thing, and Wendell took over it. Insull, the name you just mentioned, was an incredible figure. His holding companies, I think, lit up about 80% of the American utility electric usage. And with the collapse of the economy and the election of Franklin Roosevelt, in consequence, the question was, what about strategy? Are we going to be regulated? Are we going to be investigated because of the abuses of our industry? What to do? And Willkie attended, brand new in his august role, and Sam Insull said, we're going to stand tall. We're not going to be intimidated. We're so important to the economy that Roosevelt will understand our value and our force.
But the form of the holding company is deeply corrupt.
Say that again.
I mean, the holding company is a corrupt.
The holding company is an American invention, is it not?
Okay.
Out of New Jersey, in which the octopus of the holding company, as it assembles and envelops other businesses, performs miracles of accountancy, so that it's very difficult to know what the benefit of the company is, save to Wall Street and to the holding company founders. Wendell said, look, let's simply say that if we run our business transparently, efficiently, and honestly, why, we have little to fear. Insull famously said, Mr. Willkie, you're a young man, you have much to learn. And so he would, because one of the first campaign issues of Franklin Roosevelt, after saying that we had nothing to fear but fear itself, was to say, we do have to fear the holding companies, the utility industries. And Insull he campaigned on. He had for his election. Insull was the Ishmael of the American economy, and he represented the exploitation and manipulations of the holding company cadre. I think little was paid attention to of Roosevelt's denunciations of the utilities industry. I think it was thought this was campaign rhetoric, and campaign rhetoric was simply that. But in fact, the first major issuance of the 100 days was the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which would operate in the Delta, Mississippi Delta, where Commonwealth and Southern existed, and had rather efficiently provided cheap or reasonable electricity to Tennessee, to Georgia, to Florida, to North Carolina. And there really the story begins, because when Willkie was informed that Tennessee Valley would not observe any jurisdictional limitations, became the leader of the opposition to that industry's opposition to TVA. What's interesting about the story is that from 1933 to 1939, there would be this tumultuous adversarial relationship between Willkie and Roosevelt around the issue of the rights of Commonwealth and Southern to exist, which a combat which was totally unnecessary. When TVA was assembled, and the three directors, Morgan, Edward Morgan, and another Morgan, and then David Lilienthal. Morgan, the famous engineer who had drained estuaries across the country, when he was persuaded by Franklin Roosevelt to become the senior head of TVA, was assured there was no politics in this. And so when he met Willkie, he and Willkie both agreed that since Willkie's firm existed, and the dams that would power the electricity financed by the government were underway, it made good sense to collaborate. That for a period of time, the power that was transmitted by the very small Wilson Dam would be carried by Commonwealth and Southern. That was unacceptable, and so we have a combat that is finally resolved in 1939 as Wendell becomes rather famous in his opposition to Roosevelt's
his opposition to the TVA and his opposition, his trying to find a fair rate.
And of course, the argument was simply that there could be no fair relationship in which the taxpayer's dollar determined the size or the cost of the rate. It was not a matter of a market; it was a matter of the government's support. Willkie in doing so, was discovered by the loose empire as a man who could articulate the rights of industry and business not to be steamrollered by the New Deal. And in various articles written by him, The New Fear, for example, which lampooned, of course, the admonition of Roosevelt's that we had nothing to fear. Yes, we do. The fear today is the fear from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Brace Up America, another punchy piece in which he evoked the Jeffersonian heartstrings of Americans who did believe that a certain balance was required.
I mean, his motto was freedom, religion, and free enterprise. And without free enterprise, you don't have freedom.
That's exactly right. Though religion for Willkie was perhaps something that was an argument rather than a profession or a concession, you might say.
But that, you know, that American democracy has a moral component.
I think that would be fair to say. And that is to say, if business should be reproached for its successes, indeed. But as he saw it, as the 30s went on, it was government that was excessive, and the imperial presidency of FDR and the alphabetical soup of New Deal agencies invading the areas of profit and of enterprise were not to be sacrificed.
So by 1939, Willkie has become a visible figure, voice in the American political landscape. And how does he's a Democrat, but how is he brought on board as the Republican candidate in the election of 1940? Explain that.
You wouldn't have thought that would happen, as Willkie, brought up admiring William Jennings Bryan, a family that had been silver Democrats, and indeed he was, that 1920 convention in which he had participated. All of that was very much part of his political DNA. But, in fact, he said in 1936, when he did vote for Alf Landon, as Democrats for Republicans, that he was a Democrat all of his life. And now, the first time, a Democrat in the White House is one that he would rue the presence of. Democrat, yes, but because of the contest between Commonwealth and Southern and TVA and the attention that his eloquence garnered, and the increasing support and notice of large newspapers and the loose empire and the cold...
Well, also the New York Herald Tribune, which is possibly a more influential paper at the time than the Times. And he has the backing of Dorothy Thompson and Walter Lippmann. I mean, he's attracted or he's become attractive to what you would call the Eastern establishment.
Yes, and I think that's true that the Herald Tribune had more of a business impact than the New York Times in those days. The ability to articulate a cause that business had rights, responsible business needed some latitude within the economy, resulted in these speeches and articles that he wrote. and that he wrote with the assistance of a quite remarkable woman, Rita Van Doren, the lead literary editor of the Herald Tribune. She had famously been the wife of the famous Pulitzer Prize winner, Carl Van Doren, and she was quite a force in the cultural sphere of the city. They met in 1937, I believe, at a party given by Dorothy Thompson and her their then husband, the first Nobel Literature Prize winner,
Sinclair Lewis.
Sinclair Lewis. It seems to have been electric, the meeting, but it's also true that she, as one of her daughters said to me, she reformed his lousy prose. She introduced him to those dinner parties in the silk stocking area of the city, and to the Algonquin and such places. And soon Wendell fancied himself a bit of a wordsmith. He even reviewed two very interesting books for the Herald Tribune, beautifully written and subtly so. And I think it's clear that the assistance and input of Rita was decisive. But what was more important is that he began to think spaciously, and he began to think eloquently, and he began to read omnisciously, so that as he moved about the firmament of business and culture and politics, he became a more rounded and cosmopolitan figure. All of that attractive, and so with a kind of convergence of causes, he becomes someone the Republican Party, or part of the Republican Party, thinks would be of service to it.
David, I've been informed I'm already running out of time.
Oh, sure. Wow.
So we have to get very quickly to the election of 1940 and the sentiment in the country to stay out of the war in Europe, and Willkie supporting the destroyer deal with the British and the Selective Service Act.
Yes, well, let's just trip through that very quickly and say that Willkie had to change his registration. He did. And thanks to the newspaper publicity that favored him greatly, he appears in, as I call it, the Philadelphia story chapter. He appears in Philadelphia for the 1940 Republican Convention. However, the thing seems to have been a miracle, and so described. But in fact, a small wedge of the Republican Party, an internationalist, banking to a great degree, also Jewish to an important degree, people who were seeing what was afoot in Europe and the consequences of a Hitlerian dominance. Those people wondered where on earth the party could find a candidate alert to those dangers, and at the same time who could triangulate the New Deal and business. Where's the message? Who can do this? And it was a small group of people, described, I think, profiled rather well in the book, who engineered the discovery of Wendell Willkie and his registration as a Republican. The convention, Gore Vidal described it vividly. He was then 17 years old. It was his first convention, and he looked up at the balcony there and marveled that the noises coming from it were determining, indeed, the decisions on the floor. And that was because of the remarkable mobilization of the Ivy League on behalf of Wendell Willkie, thanks to the grandnephew of Orrin Root, the Secretary of Defense and State for both Roosevelt and McKinley. And that grandnephew wrote an interesting manifesto in which he summoned all the graduates of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and the rest to rally.
To the balcony in Philadelphia.
Well, they're going to get to that balcony, and so we have this remarkable response of hundreds of thousands of people, not all, of course, the graduates, but influenced by that culture. And the tickets in the balcony were distributed at something like a 9-to-1 ratio in favor of what were called Orrin Root's boys. And the death of the campaign manager, the convention manager, some think mysteriously, too propitiously. He had been in fine health, but he was a Taft man. And when he dropped dead, a Wendell Willkie advocate, Sam Pryor, who went on to be vice president of Pan American, became the manager of the convention. And the keys of the convention, as H.L. Mencken said, were in that man's pockets. And so Willkie seizes on the fifth ballot
we are now down, David, to 5 minutes.
Right?
So he loses the election.
He does lose the election, and in losing the election, he makes a speech that was extraordinary on Armistice Day, in which he says that the loyal opposition is a concept that we must abide by, and that is that a great party is a party that must be a collaborative party, not an opposition for the sake of opposition, but for the sake of consensus and of balance and of control. The loyal opposition concept, of course, if anybody reads Willkie's words, then would say we are a far cry from even the possibility of such a political phenomenon today.
Roosevelt, after Willkie dies in 1944, says that he was a godsend, and Claire Booth Luce compared him to a global Abe Lincoln.
At that point, she did. She was to change her mind and say that this man was guilty of globaloney. But
after he lost the election, he supported Roosevelt's internationalism in the years 1940.
In a remarkable way. First, a visit to England to inform himself as the Stukas and the Messerschmitts hovered above. He came back to speak to the Foreign Affairs Committee in its vote on Lend-Lease, dragging his party along. In fact, they never voted in large numbers, but just enough were peeled off by his advocates in the House and the Senate, and enough he would say enough about the importance of being supportive of Roosevelt's defense policies that the public, Republican as well, believed that was in fact the sentiment of the party.
And then he made a world tour, right?
He did, famously so.
Famous 1942.
It was 1942, August 6th of 1942, and he arrives back in the United States in Wisconsin on the 14th of October, having flown around the globe as no one had done before.
And visited something like 12 countries. He talked to people in Egypt, Palestine, Baghdad, Stalin, Madam Chiang Kai-shek and Chongqing, was extraordinary.
It-
And you describe it beautifully. I mean, I wish we had more time,
Well-
but we, I hope somebody asks him a question.
Well,
to-
let me
to-
just say
to-
that quickly out of that, yes,
Yeah.
out of that came a book describing the importance of his circumnavigation, One World, which sold fabulously well, in fact, set all sorts of records. And it seems to me the importance of that book, even though to read today you would say, well, it's a bit hokey and it's time-bound, to be sure, but at the time, it seems to be the document that announced to Americans that the privilege of their innocence was coming to an end, and that the world that they were going to inherit was a world that demanded of them a character and a kind of Wilsonian vision still that would be a benefit. That what the war was about was the Atlantic Charter. What the war was about was the diminution or the end of empire. It was democracy. And that went well with the reading public. With his party, however, it was, as I say, translated on the part of Claire Booth Luce, who had been an advocate but had changed her mind, as globaloney. And so the party, the party nobles, the old guard, decided that Wendell's utility was.
And set the course after 1947, 48 of a more imperial American foreign policy.
And that's the irony, that it's not Wendell Willkie's view of one world.
No, it's not, but it was the Henry Luce view.
And it's not Henry Wallace's view of the
No.
common man. No, it's Henry Luce. And so empire wins. But at the same time, you do have a party that, as Roosevelt said, was dragged into supporting a united front that, of course, led to the defeat of Nazism and to some understanding of the complexity of the post-war world.
Last question. I'm sorry we don't have enough time to listen to David speak at length. It's a truly wonderful book and full of detail, and the portrait that you draw of Willkie is that of a man who was described by one of Roosevelt's biographers as a man who ate too much, drank too much, smoked too much, and loved too much.
It's a wonderful judgment by by the historian of Eleanor Roosevelt, Blanche Wiesen Cook, and you couldn't have found.
But where is his like today? I mean, we are in a similar mess, and
We are.
I mean, I think the Democrats might think about nominating a Republican for the.
Well, and I think there is a Republican, perhaps, who might fit that bill. But I think one thing we might do, Willkie lives with us. His likeness is just on a wall outside. The building that was named for him just on 40th Street that housed the national headquarters of the NAACP and Freedom House was destroyed in the dead of night by a developer. But what was saved was the plaque designed, sculpted for him, and it is here begrimed on the wall of the New York Public Library, perhaps an appropriate memento of his extraordinary contributions to his country and the decency of his public protests.
All right. I mean, do you want to set it up for questions?
Down here, pick on folks, so there'll be a couple people in the audience with microphones, so raise your hands and.
Yes, ma'am, over here on the side.
Hello, I used to work in the Wendell Willkie building 40 years ago, and it's sad that it was destroyed. But I wanted to ask you about, given Willkie's fascination with Marxism, what his attitude was towards Soviet Russia, towards Lenin and Stalin. You mentioned he visited Stalin, and how that affected his own definition of freedom. Did he just focus on free enterprise, or did he have a larger definition?
Yes, the interaction with Joseph Stalin is an interesting one. Willkie, as guest of the Russians, debated the values of capitalism at the drop of a hat with Russians and indeed with Stalin. He was indulged, I suppose. He just said, you people, you can't be free unless you have the right to say things to your government and what have you. It was an American spiel. However, he was impressed by, because after all, America had gone into a depression, the Russians had not. And so he was impressed by the scale of industrial growth, the agricultural development. Mind you, he knew that the collectivization had been brutal, but he was honest enough to want to appreciate why the Russian people thought that their experiment was of great value and benefit. I think that in that way, he and FDR were much closer in their understanding or misunderstanding of what would be required when World War II ended. And that was that it would be possible to work with the Russians, that the systems, though antagonistic, were not like antimatter. And Willkie's, had Willkie lived, it would have been interesting and invaluable to see a man who had debated Stalin, who had taken Stalin's desires back to his inventory of what was needed, since we were not going to live up to our promised second front for quite some time. He took back the concessions that Stalin was prepared to make, Stalin had said, we Russians will take care of the Germans if you give us what we need. And Willkie, who had been sent on this mission, was startled to find that the second front was not to happen in 1942 or 1943, but in late 1944. So we have someone whose hands-on interaction with de Gaulle, with Stalin, with Mao Zedong's man in Kuomintang, China, Zhou Enlai, would certainly have responded to the problems of the peace with great, it seems to me, intellectual nimbleness and a kind of personal experience which would have been of some significance.
Yes, sir. Down in front, please. Well, we're
Recording it, so it's yeah.
Thank you for coming here this evening, Dr. Lewis. Would you care to comment on Willkie's relationship and friendship with the NAACP chairman at the time, Walter White, and also Willkie's progressivism on the issue of civil rights?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because that was the next one I was getting to. Thank you.
Yes, I like that question as well, because it actually explains why I wrote, in part, the book. Years ago, when I was researching another book, it had to do with the Harlem Renaissance, called When Harlem Was in Vogue, I came across a letter from Wendell Willkie to Walter White, the then president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And it said, you know, I have never enjoyed myself so much as that evening. People think that I'm depressed because my own party has turned against me. No, I'm not. But you understand what I stood for. And I hope we can get together again. And yes, we are going to finish writing that book that you and I are going to write together about race in America. And I thought, what an extraordinary exchange, and I put it aside. Now, the letter can't be found now at the Library of Congress for some reason, nor at the Beinecke, but I did see it, I did take notes of it, and I thought, so that as I finished the book, I wanted to address that special relationship that I then was able to document between the two men. And it was both an ego match. They both had titanic egos, White and Wendell. They both were charismatic. It is true, though, that Wendell saw the demographic aspect of a kind of civil rights agenda for the Republican Party that would not reverse the 1936 migration of most African Americans into the Democratic Party, but would in fact capture the leadership class of African America, because although there was much to celebrate in the way of the New Deal, much of it was not beneficial to African Americans because of the South's role in controlling the legislation and the exclusion of Social Security from African Americans and the Wagner Act and various other things. And so those people with some education, some professional sustenance, and the newspapers speaking to those people were quite alienated from the New Deal. And it was Wendell Willkie who began to verbalize a position of justice, of affirmative action, of appointment of the first Supreme Court justice, black, to his court if he won. That was very much part of the energy of that relationship between the two. And finally, the most extraordinary moment, I think, in that relationship, in its earnest, was that Wendell Willkie addressed nationally on the three networks in 1943 the nation as he spoke to the national conference of the NAACP. This was the first time a leader or titular leader of a political party had done so. And in doing so, he talked about the American version of imperialism, which he said was racism, and spoke really with a conviction that was quite remarkable. And of course, later, Harry Truman, again with Walter White by his side, would amplify that role. But that was an unprecedented thing. It both was a performance act for votes, but at the same time, I think it represented the idealism and political pragmatism of a Wendell Willkie.
But even as a young man, he was eloquent in his attack on racism when he fought the KKK in Akron.
He did indeed. Yes, that was quite a victory, and it was very useful on the hustings to be able to say that later.
Yeah.
Yes.
But that was against the grain of the temper of the times.
It was indeed. Yes, the Klan, as we know from a quite useful new book, shows that the Ku Klux Klan, the second Klan, had cleaned itself up and had, having defeated African Americans, proceeded to attack Jews and Catholics, but with less violence. And in the Midwest and in Ankara in Ohio and places like that, and indeed in Indiana, Willkie's own state, it flourished alarmingly.
Yeah, but he was constantly in opposition to it.
Indeed.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Next question.
So we have time for one more question. Oh, yes, back there, please.
Forgive my slight ignorance, but I hadn't heard anything to the contrary. Was Wendell Willkie ever elected or appointed to any public office in his career? And if he wasn't, how did he manage to meet Chiang Kai-shek and Stalin and all these other foreign leaders with such with the weight, apparently the weight of America behind him, would seem.
I'm afraid because I rushed out without my hearing aids, I'm going to have to ask that, Louis, would you,
I didn't hear it either.
I'm so sorry.
He asked whether Willkie had ever held elected office, and if not, how did he manage to go on this world tour and meet such an impressive array of leaders?
Well, the answer to the first is no. He had never held an elective office. In that regard, of course, he mirrors or anticipates our incumbent businessman. And as to the mission around the world, he proposed this to FDR. He thought that by knowing firsthand the people and the places that America was going to have to deal with when the assumption of victory was fulfilled was absolutely important to do so. Now, his party said, look, you're going to be out of the country as the midterm elections approach. This is a waste of political opportunity. You could have thought so, but he arrived in time with a radio address to the nation, the largest ever in terms of volume of his listeners, and then the remarkable book, so that when the election of the November elections happened, the Republican Party enormously benefited from the perception that he was speaking for the heart and soul of his party, which he was not. Which he could not, because the heart and soul of the party was, as today, quite different in terms of, not internationalism, it's quite internationalist, but in terms of its abidance of a social contract that is positive and promising.
Well, on that optimistic note, before I ask you to join me in giving these two fine gentlemen a hand,